Hey everyone, welcome tonight to our Humanities Film Series at Central Penn College. I thought that our numbers would be greater, but this allows me to speak with a little bit more confidence, knowing that it's just this friendly small group. You guys are in for a real treat, and I'm glad that you're here. I know that we're all Harry Potter fans. I doubt you would come out if you weren't. But I have never met someone who loves Harry Potter more than our presenter tonight, Dr. Marcie Rovan. I got to know Marcie first 3 years ago when I started working here. Marcie was a new employee. She currently serves as the director of first-year writing in our general education department. So if you are a student and taking English 101 or 102, there's a great chance that Marcie will be your instructor. And I know that in her own personal work, there's nothing that she likes less more than researching and writing about Harry Potter. She's currently putting the final touches on a book, actually, about teaching with Harry Potter. So a real treat tonight. I'm glad that Marcie's agreed to speak to us tonight. My name is Dr. Brant Ellsworth. I am an assistant professor of humanities, also at the college. And this Humanities Film Series was something that I started when I first started. I love films. I love watching movies. And when I was a college student, for the first time I recognized that movies meant more to me than just forms of entertainment. The more that I learned about a film, about the director and the actors, as I paid more attention and pulled back the layers, I realized that there was this full undiscovered world inside each film. I had gone to movies, my mom asked, "Did you like it?" I was like, it's just a visceral response, yes or no. But the more I watched movies and the more that I learned about them, the more I was able to pull back and better understand things like cinematography, camera angles. I was able to pay attention to things like themes and motifs, being able to be a better connoisseur, perhaps, of the actors and the way that they approach their trade. So I don't want to take too much time, and I want to give this over to Marcie, but I want to thank you all and invite Marcie forward, and please welcome her with a round of applause.
Thank you. So as Dr. Ellsworth said, I am a rabid anti-Harry Potter fan, so I am going to try to stick to the presentation as much as possible so that I can also stick to the time schedule. However, if anybody would like to talk to me about Harry Potter ad nauseum, please know that I have no limits. So we're going to talk about the 5th Harry Potter film today, which is the one we selected, which may seem a little odd for a film series to just watch one film from the middle of a series. But what we're really looking at with the movie today is this idea of resistance and grassroots activism, which I think Rowling builds throughout her series, but it really starts to take shape in this book and in this film. And so we are going to be focusing on Dumbledore's army. Throughout Rowling's book, she makes a lot of historical parallels to ideas of injustice, fascism, terrorism throughout history. So we see a lot of intentional parallels to Nazi Germany, for example. And if anybody is the kind of obsessive person that pays attention to minute details in literature and analyzes them and picks them apart, like someone with a PhD in English, you'll notice that the second Harry Potter book is actually taking place in 1992, and that it is the 50th anniversary of when the Chamber of Secrets was opened, which means that the Chamber of Secrets was opened at the same time that Auschwitz was opened. And so you see things like that sort of subtly embedded throughout the text. But there's a lot of intentional parallels to this idea of the dangers of fascism, the dangers of this kind of us versus them mentality. She essentially sets up the series as a cautionary tale about the things that can happen when we are too focused on differences and we don't really pay attention to commonalities. So throughout the books, you'll see a lot of reminders of past mistakes, and this comes out a lot in the 5th book and in the 5th film as well. The idea that the government is willing to ignore a threat in order to avoid war. So I'm assuming that most of you have read the Harry Potter books or watched the films and are aware of what happened in the first 4, but just in case you're not, at the end of the preceding film and book, Lord Voldemort has come back to power. He has regained form, he has regained his body, and Harry is the witness to this. And he informs the government, and the government just refuses to believe it. And so there's this very tense scene between the Minister of Magic and Professor Dumbledore, where he's saying, like, this is what you need to do to stop him from coming to full power the way he did last time. And the minister just says, no, people will panic. I can't be in charge when this is happening. And so the government chooses to turn a blind eye. And you can see a lot of parallels here with what happened in Hitler's rise to power. So the idea of appeasement, right? Give Hitler the Sudetenland and maybe he'll leave us alone. And then it keeps going from there. So instead of dealing with the threat, the government has chosen to ignore it. And not just to ignore it, but to openly pretend it's a lie. And so you have the media and the government and even professors trying to discredit the student and Professor Dumbledore, suggesting that they're doing this for attention or because they're losing their minds and everything is just fine and don't look over here, nothing is going on. And so what do we do as a society when we're faced with this parallel? When we know that there is a tremendous threat facing our world and the government is choosing not to recognize it or actually aiding it. And this film is beginning to suggest what we need to do. So we have the idea that acceptance is complicity. By refusing to fight, to refusing to resist, simply going along with the flow, you are a part of the problem. And even children, even teenagers have power, and they need to utilize that power to actually make a difference in their society. So it sort of comes up a lot with this idea of dehumanizing the other. And I know we've probably seen a lot of political commentary lately talking about this in terms of some of the situations at the border, that the more we consider someone else not us, right? The more that they're different, the more that they're separate, the more that they're other, the easier it is to not care about what's happening to them because it's not happening to us. And so Rowling does this throughout her series, calls attention to these problems through things that are sort of removed from our world. So it's not about Caucasians versus African Americans or Hispanics, but it's about wizards versus muggles. It's about pure-blooded wizards versus half-blooded or muggle-born wizards. It's about wizards versus giants or elves or werewolves or other things that are less than, not as much as, not us. So we see this presented throughout the book with a suggestion that this is something we need to fight. And I think the film does a really wonderful job of portraying this. So I think it's important to recognize that all works of literature and film are in some ways responding to a cultural moment. And it's kind of difficult to talk about with this movie because it's a movie based on a book. So we've sort of got two different cultural moments happening here. The film came out in July 2007, but it's based on the book which came out 4 years earlier. So I think it's important to recognize a little bit of what's going on in our society in 2003. This book was written, the fifth book was written in the wake of September 11th. And so it's the beginning of the war on terror. It's the beginning of this recognition that we are no longer safe where we think we are most safe, we are still vulnerable, as well as this sort of war furor that comes up in result of that, as well as protests against that. And so it's a very politically engaged moment. You see a lot of Islamophobia coming out, where people are targeting someone because they look like someone who is a terrorist. And so we get the sense of how that idea of identity politics becomes really dangerous here. And we also see this sort of US-British coalition gearing up for the Iraq war, and the US and British citizens saying this is not good. So we see a lot of major worldwide peace protests breaking out. Student activism really involved in a lot of these protests. In February of 2003, so just a few months before this book was released, was the largest political protest in London's history at the time. That may no longer be true. And so you have a lot of people who are in disagreement with their government and are feeling the need to speak out and to protest, but don't necessarily know how to go about fighting, how to go about resisting. And so in many ways, this book is responding to a lot of that political frustration that the author and the readers and the community are feeling. And Rowling speaks to this directly in a lot of interviews. She says that this was intentional, that this book is meant, these movies, these books are meant to be politically engaged. They're meant to be responding to our environment and telling us that what we see is not okay, and when it's not okay, we need to speak out. So I love this quote. It's from an interview. She says, "I wanted Harry to leave our world and find exactly the same problems in the wizarding world. So you have the intent to impose a hierarchy. You have bigotry and this notion of purity, which is this great fallacy, but it crops up all over the world. People like to think themselves superior, and that if they can pride themselves in nothing else, they can pride themselves on perceived purity. The Potter books in general are a prolonged argument for tolerance, a prolonged plea for an end to bigotry, and I think it's one of the reasons that some people don't like the books. But I think it's a very healthy message to pass on to younger people, that you should question authority, and you should not assume that the establishment or the press tells you all of the truth." So the books and the film are meant to be really politically engaged and clearly with a bit of a liberal ideology, suggesting to us that we need to be really proactive about fighting bigotry and fighting this sort of false representations of the other. So in terms of the film, what we're going to see is how this plays out. And we see this in two different realms. We see this what's happening outside of Hogwarts in the larger political realm, and we see what's happening inside the walls of the school. So outside of Hogwarts, we have this approaching war. Lord Voldemort has returned. Whether or not the government recognizes it, he is gaining followers, he is gaining power, people are disappearing, things are happening. And you also have the resistance fighters, and we'll talk about them in a second. But this key idea that the government refuses to believe that this is happening because the leaders are more concerned with their own power, with their own position, than they are with security, truth, or justice. All those in power really care about is staying in power. And because of that, it makes the government and the country vulnerable. So what we have instead of any sort of organized resistance from the government or the military is this organization fighting in the shadows. And so we have the Order of the Phoenix, which is a group led by Albus Dumbledore, who fought Voldemort the last time he came to power. They're beginning to reform also in the shadows because the government would stop them if they knew this was happening because they see it as a threat to their power. And we see them gathering intelligence, gathering followers, preparing for coming war. So in the political and the outside world, we see the idea that the establishment is not going to help us, that they're too concerned with their own power to actually do anything, and that it's grassroots activism that is the only way to really fight and to resist. Inside of Hogwarts, we get sort of a microcosm of the same thing happening. There's a lower stakes insurrection and a sort of a low-key rebellion happening inside Hogwarts through Harry's entire 5th year. So we have a lot of outrage over the government's inaction from the students who are aware of what's happening. And we also have this smear campaign happening against Harry and Dumbledore. Dumbledore is still running the institution, but every day the newspaper is telling students and parents that he is full of himself, he's losing his mind, he's making things up, undermining his authority both within and beyond the walls of Hogwarts. And so we see students leaving school because their parents don't think that Dumbledore knows what he's doing. We see Harry's friends and classmates turning on him because their parents don't believe him and didn't want them to be associated with him. And we see how all of this sort of plays out in one kid's life. And I think it's important that we remember that he is a kid. He is 15 years old, and he has the entire might of the Ministry of Magic trying to destroy his credibility and in some ways his life. And so here we also have the Hogwarts High Inquisitor, right? Dolores Umbridge, who is perhaps my favorite villain in all of literature because she is just so deliciously awful and also seems to be sort of just an exaggeration of every bad teacher you've ever had in your life, right? The one who is all about discipline and punish, the government, the establishment, surveillance, and nothing about independence or freedom or critical thinking. She is actively preventing students from learning defensive magic because the government is so paranoid that they are afraid that Professor Dumbledore is secretly raising an army of students who will be loyal to him. So they impose their own teacher on the school, and they say that she will teach defense, and what we will do is we will learn theory. We will all sit in a classroom every day silently reading from a book. And we all know, I'm sure, that that is just the best way to get an education, right? I know some of us are students here and some of us are professors, so I'm sure that we all know that this is not the way to learn anything, but that's the point. The goal is to actively prevent students from learning this stuff because the government fears what that can do with that knowledge. And so we end up with another sort of grassroots rebellion, another sort of organization in the shadows fighting and resisting, but this time it's an organization made up of students. And you have teenagers fighting for what they believe is the fight of their lives. So very similar to what's been happening in the contemporary moment with some of the student activism against climate change and gun control legislation and things like that that we saw in the wake of Parkland shooting. We have students who are the voice of a revolution, students who are fighting, who are resisting, training for battle, and undermining Umbridge's regime. They're sort of fighting their own government injustices on a lower scale. So the point that Rowling's making here is this idea that good people cannot stand by and watch injustice. That if you are a morally upright individual, you cannot stand by while someone else is suffering. If you have the power to do something, you have to act. You have to take action however you can, despite the risks. And it doesn't matter if you're going to get expelled, it doesn't matter if you're going to get arrested. If something is wrong, you have to act. And if you know the right thing to do, you need to do it. And I think one of the important messages that we'll see played out throughout this film is the idea that our actions do have consequences. And sometimes they're positive and sometimes they're negative. There's a lot of loss in this film, there's a lot of tragedy, there's a lot of risk that happens because of the actions that they take. But that in no way suggests that they're wrong for taking them. And so we have this idea that yes, we should take action, yes, we may lose something, yes, it may be bad for us personally, but it's the right thing to do, and therefore we need to do it. And we also get this idea that collective action is more powerful. If you are a lone individual railing against the government and trying to be the prophet of what's going to happen and what we need to do about it, you might seem like a crazy person on the street corner professing the doom of civilization. But as soon as you can get other like-minded individuals invested in a cause, you have more power, you have more authority, and you have more ability to actually affect change. And what I love most about this film is the idea that it doesn't matter who you are. Even teenagers can make a difference. So the people that we see in these two organizations, one is made up entirely of teenagers who are in school, who are underage, who are limited in their magical abilities and even when they're allowed to exercise them by law. And the other is made up of people who are primarily disregarded by the establishment. So we have half-bloods, we have muggle-borns, we have what are considered blood traders, who are pure-blooded wizards who hang out with muggle-borns and really like muggles. We have a werewolf, we have a giant, we have all of these people that the establishment says are less than. And those are the ones who've united to form this resistance who are actually going to make a difference in the society. So we have another Rowling quote here that I think is really relevant to this conversation. The idea that unlike any other creature on this planet, human beings can learn and understand without having experienced. They can think themselves into other people's places. And many prefer not to exercise that imagination at all. They choose to remain comfortably within the bounds of their own experience, never troubling to wonder how it would feel to have been born other than they are. They can refuse to hear screams or peer inside cages. They can close their hearts and minds to any suffering that does not touch them personally. They can refuse to know. I might be tempted to envy people who can live that way, except that I do not think that they have any fewer nightmares than I do. And so what she's saying here is that literature and film have power. Creativity, imagination has power. Clearly this is something that I believe, or I wouldn't have spent 10 years of my life studying literature to get a PhD in it, or I wouldn't be participating in a film series. So the idea that by forcing people to look, to empathize, to imagine the experience of others, we can actually have an impact on who they are and what they believe. That we need to experience things vicariously through our imagination in order to recognize the importance. And this is exactly what the Harry Potter film and book series has done. So there have actually been studies done recently that have found that entire generations' ideas about war, leadership, The dangers of consolidation of power and of dictatorship, about the importance of dissent, and about heroism and sacrifice have been shaped, at least in part, by J.K. Rowling. One study actually found in the last election cycle that regardless of political affiliation, people who had read Harry Potter were less likely to support Donald Trump because they found his bullying reminiscent of Voldemort. And so it didn't have to do with political affiliation. This was looking at the primary election specifically, where there were still many other Republicans running. I'm not saying the president is Voldemort, although Rowling has. But the suggestion that simply reading this book shaped people's political ideologies in such a way that they said, no, that's bullying, that's not how we do it. I may agree with what you're saying, but the way you're saying it is not okay. So that idea that simply his personality was antithetic to this mentality. This generation has also been found to have a greater respect for respect for and tolerance of differences. And so there's a lot of, I'm sure, different factors that have played into this, the idea that millennials are one of the most empathetic and tolerant generations in centuries. But a lot of that has been connected to the Harry Potter phenomenon, which is really sort of like the Star Wars of my generation. You cannot be between the age of 25 and 35 without having read Harry Potter. There are very, very few people in that age realm who have not encountered this in some form. And so it was a very formative text for a lot of people. Not to age myself, but the 5th book came out while I was at my college orientation. And so this really gives you the sense of an entire generation shaped by these texts. The most popular children's text in history, the first billionaire author in history, predominantly, profoundly impact on our generation. What also we found in these studies is that that generation has less faith in government, which I think is perhaps maybe directly attributed to some of the things that we will shortly view in this film. The idea that the government cannot be trusted, that sometimes they're wrong. A lot more distrust of authoritarian leaders, and more inclined to take action. And so we see this sort of shift culturally in the mentality of those who grew up with Harry Potter versus the generations that preceded them. So I think that the key message of this film that we're about to watch, that we want to keep coming back to, is this idea, which is actually not a quote from this film, but I think really well emblematized in this film, that it is our choices that show us what we truly are, far more than our abilities. And so what we're going to see in this film is the importance of our choices and the actions that we take, and how these are the things that should and do define us. That it's not about what we're born into, it's not about our status, it's about what we choose to do with our power. And so without further ado, I think we are ready to start the film.